Jack Daniel's, a whiskey loved by millions. And it all comes from two unique factories that make every barrel and every drop. It's a time-honored tradition that stays true to its roots.
It's still very much the whiskey that Jack set out to make.
While finding a place for science,
Jack Daniel's has a unique chemical profile
and automation to create a legend among liquors, known the world over as simply Jack. Every new bottle of Jack Daniel's on Earth comes from this factory in tiny Lynchburg, Tennessee. Possibly the last place you'd expect to find a whiskey maker. The factory sits in the middle of an entirely dry county. For 101 of its 144 years, all alcohol sales have been banned anywhere near Lynchburg, even though making it is the lifeblood of the town. The whiskey's made right next to downtown on an 1,800-acre compound in 9 production areas. The cave spring, grain mill and fermentation area, the stills, the rickyard, and mellowing room, as well as barrel filling, warehouses, and the nearby bottling plant. 375 workers, some of them second and third generation employees, make a whiskey that's marketed in over 130 countries. Only the barrels are made elsewhere, at a cooperage in Louisville, Kentucky. Jack Daniel's whiskey comes in 3 varieties. The original Old No. 7, Double Filtered Gentleman Jack, and top-of-the-line single barrel.
All of the whiskeys start with the same whiskey and the same types of barrels. So we're able to make these different expressions of Jack Daniel's by how we process and filter them to get them to the bottle.
The distillery produces around 150 million bottles of its mainstay, Old No. 7, every year. The process of making this very traditional product in such high volume is masterminded from a control room packed with computers. The operator keeps an eye on the entire production flow from these screens. They display 7,000 pieces of information and images captured by dozens of cameras scattered all over the plant.
We monitor everything that goes on in the distillery, from the water supply to the grain coming in to the yeast mash. There's 12 monitors here, 60 plus screens, and we get alarms every 4 or 5 seconds.
The monitoring starts at the very beginning of production with water. At the heart of the compound, a natural cave spring supplies every drop used to make every bottle of Jack Daniel's. The water bubbles from the ground at a constant 56 degrees, and as far as anyone knows, it's never run dry. It's filtered through limestone bedrock, which removes most of the iron and makes it perfect for whiskey making.
Iron is terrible. It's, as they say, murderous for making whiskey. It turns it black and bitter.
The water in the cave is captured beneath the surface and fed into a system of pipes. And the production process shifts to the next location, the grain mill. This is prime #1 yellow corn. A total of 1 million pounds arrives by the truckload every day.
We weigh every truck in, and then after the truck is unloaded, we'll weigh him back out. And that tells us exactly how many pounds of grain that we bring through the distillery. The reason we do that is distillery efficiency has a lot to do with the quality of the product, and we try, to measure the distillery efficiency, you gotta know what your raw materials are.
Corn makes up 80% of the grain in Jack Daniels, with the rest split between rye and malted barley.
Corn contains the biggest part of the starch that we need. Rye is a flavoring component. It's a very pungent grain. Malt contains an enzyme system which will convert all of the starch that we have in the other grains to fermentable sugars.
The grains flow into a sealed system, which stores them in one of a dozen 30-foot tall silos.
The plant operates basically with 1 day's raw materials on hand at any given point in time.
The corn pours into a machine called a hammer mill, and inside it's hit by steel plates rotating at 1,700 revolutions per minute.
The hammer hits it, and when it hits it, it pulverizes it at that point. After it's all said and done, what comes out of this mill is basically corn flour.
Separate mills reduce the rye and barley to an equally fine consistency. Now the grains are ready to be mixed with water from the cave spring to create a magical mixture that's the foundation of every bottle of Jack. The abundance of natural resources is part of what attracted the original Mr. Jack Daniel to this location in the first place.
Jack Daniels was a real man. A lot of people think he may have been made up, but he wasn't. His real name was Jasper Newton Daniel, not Jack.
The real Jack learned to make whiskey from a local preacher as a teenager. And his was the first distillery to register with the federal government way back in 1866. But many other details of the man and his whiskey are lost, which only adds to the allure of the brand.
There are all kinds of mysteries associated with this brand and the man, Jack Daniels.
No one knows exactly when Jack Daniel was born or why he made his bottles square. Even the origin of the famous No. 7 brand is an enigma.
Some will say it's Lucky 7. Some people say that he had 7 girlfriends and his 7th was his favorite. I'm not sure that's right. Would he have called her Old No. 7? Probably not. Some people say that it was a batch, the 7th batch, and he thought it was the best, and so that was the one that he gave the label Old No. 7.
Whatever the real story is, the whiskey stays true to Jack's original recipe.
It's still very much the whiskey that Jack set out to make, and we've just carried that tradition forward and taken advantage of better technology.
That's especially true of the liquor's next key ingredient, yeast. In a testing lab, a biochemist checks the health of the single-celled microorganism that's used to convert the grains and the water in Jack Daniel's whiskey into alcohol.
You have to place a drop precisely on a little groove so that it draws the sample underneath the cover slip to present nicely underneath the microscope.
Incredibly, these cells are descended directly from the yeast Jack Daniel used almost 150 years ago.
It's something that's been performed since the early days when Jack Daniels was running the distillery, maintaining the yeast culture so that we get the right character of the distilled spirit.
Under the microscope, Jack Daniel's yeast has a telltale lemon drop shape, and this batch is in excellent health, reproducing rapidly.
I look at it for shape, I look at it for size. I want to make sure that it's budding, that it's actively reproducing itself. This cell is in the very early stages of budding. You can see the small bud. This one's slightly larger yet, and now it's becoming almost the size. The daughter cell is almost the size of the mother cell. Pretty soon that will split off, and then we'll begin the process over.
This sample is ready to seed a new generation of yeast in a process which takes place under carefully controlled laboratory conditions.
It's critical to keep the culture sterile, to not introduce any bacteria into the system. And we want it to be as active as possible so that it gets into the fermenter and starts fermenting very quickly, outcompeting any natural contaminants that might come in with the grains. This is a live active culture. You can see by the CO2 that's evolving in there, the bubbles that are forming, the foam. That culture is a few days old, and now I'm going to take it and transfer into another culture.
First, he sterilizes the test tube with a flame. Then transfers the healthy live cells to a solution of yeast-friendly nutrients. The test tube contains just 50 ounces of yeast. As it reproduces and more nutrients added, it's transferred to bigger and bigger containers, ending with these giant vats, where it will work its magic to convert water and grain into alcohol and help keep today's whiskey consistent with the original. At the Jack Daniel's factory in Tennessee, water, grain, and yeast all come together in the fermentation area. This vast steamy room houses 64 giant steel vats. Each one holds 40,000 gallons, enough to fill around 3 million bottles of Jack Daniel's. The yeast feeds on the sugars in the grain. Slowly at first, and then within a few hours, it's bubbling ferociously. The mixture ferments for up to a week under constant surveillance by the operator in the factory's control room.
The valve page, I keep that one up most of the time to see what's open, what's steaming, and the temperature of the fermenters.
On another screen, a series of numbers shows the consistency of the mash, a crucial factor in maintaining the flow.
Pretty much one of the worst things that could happen is the cooker can get thick and it will not agitate, and it could stop up our mash cooler.
The yeast converts the sugars in the grain into alcohol in the form of ethanol, creating a heady slush with a pungent and familiar odor.
This is what we get after a week of fermentation.
It's called distiller's beer.
It's basically the same type of thing that you get in a bottle of beer. The difference is all the grain particles are still in this beer. It's about 11.5% alcohol.
And a simple click of the mouse is all it takes to send the finished distiller's beer to its next destination. The whiskey stills. In this towering 60-foot-tall building, 4 enormous stills transform the distiller's beer into a much purer and stronger form of alcohol. It's a process called distillation.
Distillation basically is separating a very volatile material from the beer. And that volatile material is basically alcohol.
The mixture flows into the system, seen here through an observation window. Inside the still, the mixture flows across a series of hot metal plates, heating it to around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And because alcohol turns into vapor at a lower temperature than water, the alcohol vapor separates and rises to the top of the still. The vapor then flows into a device called a condenser, where it cools and turns back into a liquid, which flows out of the bottom of the system.
The alcohol goes through this line, 1 floor up, crosses over, goes all the way to the bottom floor, which is over 100 feet down that way. It is then sent back upstairs, over and down through a condenser.
The distilled liquor flows out of the stills at a rate of up to 9,000 gallons an hour. Unlike finished whiskey, the liquid is crystal clear, but it packs an even bigger punch than the finished product, at a mind-numbing 140 proof. Because without barrels, whiskey would look like water, and Jack Daniel's would be missing one of its most crucial ingredients. Every Jack Daniels barrel is made at the Brown-Forman Cooperage, 230 miles north of the Lynchburg compound in Louisville, Kentucky.
We've been making barrels here at this facility for over 65 years, and Jack Daniels has been getting their barrels from here for that same amount of time.
Every one is constructed in a traditional manner, held together without screws or glue, so nothing gets in the way of its main job.
Barrel plays a very important part of the whiskey making process. It's responsible for 100% of the color that comes into our whiskey and about 40-50% of the flavor.
The men and women who make barrels are called coopers, from the Latin word cupa, meaning vat. The barrels come together in the wood yard, milling area, raising station, the toasting room, charring oven, and testing department. This place turns out 2,000 of the finely crafted containers in a day. The entire plant runs on generators fueled by waste wood and sawdust. About 6 months after arriving at the factory, the wood is dried to perfection and moved to the milling area. Here, the rough planks, or staves, are fed into a series of machines that cut them to length and width. Then grind the wood so that it will fit together and bend without any gaps or leaks.
This is a stave joining machine that has a bunch of knives that are spinning around, removing material from the end of the staves to make the middle wider than the ends are, so the middle of the barrel is wider. They come in like this, then any material is being removed from the middle, and the ends are cut so that the middle is wider than the ends.
Even the round tops and bottoms of the barrels are built out of white oak without any glue or screws. They're cut to shape by a saw. And then a robot dips them in paraffin wax, which temporarily holds the pieces in place. A worker known as the dot man keeps track of the staves exiting the production line before they move from milling to what's known as barrel raising.
Barrel raising is where they take the staves and assemble them in a ring and actually lift the barrel up where it can stand on its own.
The barrel raisers work hard to keep up with a strict production target, shown on giant LED screens. Overhead conveyors drop the metal hoops used to temporarily hold the barrel together. They build the barrels out of 31 irregular-shaped pieces of wood. Each one is carefully selected by hand.
If you don't alternate the pieces of wood as you go around, the barrel won't bend correctly. You put too many narrow staves in a row, they bend a little easier than the wide stave, so it makes a default in the barrel.
Next stop, a steam shower. About 25 minutes at 150 degrees softens up the lumber for final shaping.
The wood becomes pliable where we can bend it, put on the other temporary head hoop without the staves breaking.
The freshly formed barrel moves on to the next step in the process, a secret room where no cameras are allowed, the toasting room. Behind these screens, the barrels undergo a unique flavor-enhancing procedure used only by Jack Daniels.
The barrel's exposed to a light temperature, radiant heat, just like you're toasting a marshmallow or bread. And it brings the sugars and caramels to the surface of the wood.
Upon leaving the toasting room, the bare wood inside has a golden sheen, which helps more flavor from the wood transfer to the whiskey during aging. Workers use a mirror to check the color and ensure that the wood is evenly toasted. Once they're ready, the barrel enters a giant machine called the Buffalo. An iron bar flips it off the conveyor and into the machine. The Buffalo inserts 2 more temporary hoops in the center of the barrel. Then spins it. The centrifugal force forces the staves against the steel hoops to tighten the fit. A powerful vise which squeezes the hoops with almost 1,000 pounds of pressure finishes the job. After the Buffalo's work is done, the barrels move to the next and most spectacular stage on the production line, the charring station. Here, a conveyor delivers them to a steel oven with 8 powerful gas burners. A machine flips the barrels onto one end, and they head into the heat.
Whenever they go in, a flame will shoot up underneath it, and it'll just char the inside of it to a black kind of color.
The jets actually set the barrel itself on fire for around 25 seconds.
When it comes out, water sprayer underneath it that puts out the flame.
150 barrels come through charring every hour. And keeping up with the flow in this intense environment takes a strong nerve and concentration.
Gotta keep an eye on everything, make sure everything's running right. Because pretty much take your eye off of it, you don't catch it. It's a big mess. You might, you get hurt, you'll fall down, get burned. Try to stay out there as much as possible, but you never know. I burn a lot of clothes. Go through a lot of gloves because they melt.
But without the fire, Jack just wouldn't be Jack.
That's pretty much what gives it the flavor. The char, it soaks into the wood and just gets its flavor, its texture.
Next, the tops and bottoms go on. And workers replace the temporary hoops with permanent steel bands using specialized machines. A worker with a laser-guided drill makes an opening in the barrel, a hole traditionally called a bunghole. He quickly lines up the drill with the strongest part of the barrel.
Where your rivets are, that's where you want to drill your bunghole. Get you here and fix it out.
He fills the barrel with air and water under pressure.
It puts pressure in it so the guys up there can see where the leaks are.
The barrel moves on to its final stop on the production line, testing.
Look for leaks, wormholes, streaks, rough joints, like that's sort of rough right there. That water, when it gets mixed with wood, it swells. The wood swells, so stuff like that, it'll stop leaking. If it was any worse than that, you have to take it out, repair it, send it over to my cooper.
As a final check, he simply removes the cork and checks the rush of air under pressure. This barrel is ready to roll, marked with the final seal of approval.
When we stamp it, that means it's ready to go.
And it's got to roll right now. Because an empty barrel is a barrel that's about to fall apart.
It's essential to the barrel making process so we get them out as soon as we can. What happens is they dry up, and once they start to dry up, the hoops on the barrel, the metal bands that you see, will actually loosen up and fall off.
The barrels hit the road within hours of completion. 8 trucks a day leave the cooperage and head south, because down in Lynchburg, the whiskey is waiting. At the Jack Daniels compound, up to 1,000 pints of distilled liquor gushes off the stills every minute. At this stage, it's potent, pungent, but as clear as water. The crucial next step defines Jack Daniels as a Tennessee whiskey. It begins with a huge fire made of sugar maple wood.
We use sugar maple because it's the only wood that don't have a taste or smell to it.
They soak it with Jack Daniels whiskey as a primer.
This here is, it's 140 proof. It comes straight off the steel.
And then light it. After an hour or so, the fire collapses and the wood turns to charcoal. Workers damp it down, then run it through a grinder to reduce the charcoal to 1/4-inch pellets.
When it comes off the fire, it's too big, so we want to crush it down, about the size of a pea. The machine's got too big of rollers in it. When it goes down between them, it just crushes the charcoal.
The freshly ground load heads down the hill to the charcoal mellowing room. It's headed for one of 72 giant vats. Here, it meets up with the whiskey channeled direct from the still through a network of pipes.
This is all copper. That's important in the process because it actually interacts and strips certain things out of the whiskey as it flows through it.
The pipes suspended in Christmas tree formation are peppered with tiny holes, so the whiskey slowly drips through 10 feet of charcoal. Much like a filter on a water faucet, it removes impurities as well as softens the flavors.
Every drop of whiskey has got to work its way through 10 feet to get out the bottom. The grainy identity of the whiskey is absorbed into the charcoal so that what comes out the bottom is much lighter and sweeter, a much more clarified and lighter whiskey.
This process is what distinguishes Jack from the bourbons made elsewhere in the American South.
Jack Daniels is very closely kin to bourbon, but by the time every drop of whiskey has made it through 10 feet of hard sugar maple charcoal, it is then called a Tennessee whiskey.
The original Jack Daniel wasn't the only distiller to use charcoal mellowing. But what made him stand out from the crowd was an uncanny knack for public relations, long before the term existed.
Mr. Jack was quite an innovator. Jack knew that music could draw a crowd, and so he started the Jack Daniels Silver Cornet Band. They would come to Jack's bars on the squares and entertain.
The reputation of Jack Daniels soon spread far beyond Lynchburg's tiny town square. In 1904, he took his whiskey to a competition at the World's Fair in St. Louis.
There were judges of that whiskey competition from all over the world, and they found this little distillery in Tennessee made a remarkable whiskey and gave it the gold medal. Jack Daniels was an amazing individual. He started out with literally nothing. And when he died, he was the wealthiest man for several counties. He owned the town's first automobile. He had a home with a ballroom upstairs, a library, and a Steinway grand piano.
In Mr. Jack's day, the distillery's output was never more than 99 bushels of whiskey a day, less than 1% of today's output. But no matter how big the business gets, Jack Daniel's is still deeply connected to its founder and the magical place where every bottle is made. After up to 6 days of traditional charcoal mellowing, the liquor is ready for the barrel. "2,000 freshly made beauties arrive at the compound almost every day. These 100-pound oak containers rolled off the Louisville line just a few days ago. And now they're ready for filling with the legendary liquor for which they were made. The distilled charcoal filtered alcohol flows from the mellowing room to the barrel filling area. A two-man team pumps over 100,000 gallons every single day. Here, the smell of whiskey seeps into your pores, and danger is ever present. Whiskey is, after all, extremely flammable, and right now it's 140 proof, emitting potentially lethal vapors of ethyl alcohol.
It could produce a flash fire, a fire, or even an explosion if confined and exposed to an ignition source.
From this point on in production, safety checks are tighter than ever. Using a device called a gas meter to test the vapor levels in the air.
This machine will give you an audible and visible and also a numeric reference of potential danger. And if it starts flashing and you start hearing alarms going off and I start walking away, then you walk away.
With the barrels safely filled, they're nudged onto a conveyor that carries them outside for loading. Full with whiskey, each barrel weighs around 500 pounds. There's a trick to stacking these monsters in the right order, so they don't move around and crash through the side of the truck. They're heading for one of the warehouses dotted around the area, poking above the trees like castles. It's in these creaky wooden buildings that the distilled alcohol makes its final transformation. Seven stories tall and 50 years old, this towering building is one of 77 warehouses located close to the Lynchburg compound. Like most of them, it's stacked full of whiskey, weighing 10 million pounds. A fresh load arrives from the filling station up to 7 times a day. Workers manhandle them directly onto a rusty elevator, while a team stands by upstairs. Using momentum, they take the 500-pound barrel off the lift, roll it to the selected shelf, and maneuver it into position. Most of the warehouses have a built-in safety feature that's distinctly low-tech to make sure they don't shift under the weight of all these barrels.
We've established plumb lines that run from the roof to the ground floor that basically identify what is the plumb center of this building.
And if the plumb line touches the sides of the hull, it means the building is leaning to one side, and new barrels must be loaded in a location that corrects the imbalance. These guys load up to 1,000 barrels in a day, which means they're moving a weight equal to about 100 Ford F-150 trucks. It looks easy, but it's not. Barrels are heavy and awkward to handle, and sometimes things get out of hand. Every inch of this place is crammed with up to 20,000 barrels, aging on wooden shelves.
A lot of people don't know it, but the warehouse is really where a lot of the magic of whiskey making happens.
As the whiskey sits in the warehouse, the variations in temperature caused by the changing of the seasons makes the wood and the alcohol expand and contract.
What that does is it begins to force it through the pores of the wood, so you'll get a lot of interaction, the whiskey passing through the toasted and charred layer. That's where it's going to gain all of its color. It's going to gain over half of its flavor from the barrel. So this is a very, very important part of the process.
The precise location of the barrels in the warehouse has an enormous effect on how the whiskey matures. The higher you go, the more the temperature varies, so the barrel imparts more flavor. That's why it's important to keep a detailed record of each barrel's resting place and history. And the top floor barrels take on a special flavor, reserved for the top-of-the-line single-barrel whiskey.
The area located right here is called the Angel's Roost. It's the highest and hottest location of the warehouse that you get maximum interaction between the whiskey and the barrel. You get very high intensity of character and flavor.
But here in the Angel's Roost, more whiskey evaporates from each barrel than anywhere else in the warehouse. It's what distillers call the Angel's Share.
We'll lose about 30% of an Angel's Share in the locations right here, so we assume that's where the angels must congregate.
Jack Daniels ages in the warehouse for between 4 and 7 years. But the ultimate test is not time, but aroma and appearance.
First, we draw the sample out, then we place a cedar peg, something that's a little bit softer than the oak barrel, so it'll conform to the drill hole, drives in easily, and it won't rot. There's a certain time in the warehouse that the whiskey is gaining in quality and flavor and character, and then there's a time over which it would become very bitter and less drinkable and enjoyable. We don't want to stay in the warehouse too long.
Years of contact with the charred and toasted barrel have infused the liquor with a unique flavor.
It should be a nice balance of the sweet vanilla, caramel, butterscotchy notes from the barrel, and a nice finish balance as far as the toasted oak.
And given it the warm amber color Jack Daniels is famous for.
This whiskey is a little over 3 years old, and it looks like it's maturing as I would expect a sixth floor barrel to be maturing. At this point, you can see it's already gained a lot of the color that we would expect in a mature whiskey. Every drop of Jack Daniels whiskey goes into the barrel just as clear as water. But you can see that just in 3 years, the nice amber color that's been formed, all of that color has come from its time in the barrel.
Just a few more years to go, and these babies will be ready for the bottle. It's finally time for the finished liquor to move on to the nearby bottling plant, where 8 production lines finish the job in a rapid-fire clatter and blur of machinery and glass.
A lot of pinch points, lots of moving equipment. You know, if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, you could easily, get yourself hurt.
The danger from whiskey vapors is higher here than anywhere else. It's a place where cameras are rarely allowed.
We're very careful not to introduce ignition sources into this building.
The process of getting whiskey into the bottle begins with a box and a dozen empty bottles. A machine flips them over, lifts the box onto an overhead line, and sends the bottles marching on. Next, they enter a complex machine that looks like a carousel, where they're held by the neck and raised up to meet an injector. At this point, the whiskey is 80 proof, diluted from barrel strength by demineralized water. The injector fills a bottle in 4 seconds or less. On the way to the next step, a plexiglass shield above the bottles keeps debris from falling into the precious liquid. Before the tops go on, and the bottles pass through an X-ray machine to check that they're full and that the cap is on correctly. Next, a specialized label pasting machine takes over. On one side, the system sucks in glue. On the other, it takes in labels and gently pastes them onto the glass. Despite the high level of automation in bottling, the human touch remains essential, just as it's always been.
It takes a lot of people to pull off getting bottle from one end of the process to the other.
Almost 150 years after Jack Daniel's invention, bottles aren't the only thing pasted with the famous logo. At the Jack store in downtown Lynchburg, you can buy everything from coffee and clothing to mustard and motorcycles. But in the end, it all comes down to the quality and consistency of the whiskey. Before these boxes are ready to leave the warehouse, each batch is subjected to its final and possibly most important test. It's the job of master taster Jeff Norman to make sure the whiskey stays consistent year after year.
We are in what we call the retains room, and every batch of Jack Daniel's whiskey that we bottle, we actually keep a sample of that batch. We have a 2-year running sample profile here.
Every Friday, the taster hosts a parade of workers in a room that looks like a voting booth. These are the company's official tasters, all employees with regular jobs elsewhere in the plant. But now they're taking part in a mass taste test. Every week, up to 100 testers sample the whiskey before it ships, in a test designed to be an objective scientific exam. In front of them, 3 unknown, unmarked samples of Jack Daniel's. Their challenge is to identify any whiskey that tastes different.
Our employees will nose the whiskey, they will taste the whiskey.
To keep the testers on their toes, the source of the 3 samples varies. Sometimes they're from different batches, but today they're all the same.
Hopefully, they won't find a difference.
In this case, the testers mark down the correct answers. All 3 samples match. This whiskey is ready for the big wide world. And every drop made with love in one tiny town in Tennessee.